Good afternoon, everyone. We are beginning now.
So, good afternoon, everyone. I extend a warm welcome to all of you participating in this online masterclass series organized by the School of Human Ecology. We are meeting each other at a very difficult time, and that too in a virtual mode. That has become the new normal for all of us. I'm told that there are a lot of students from India and outside India, many countries across the world that are participating in this series, and I welcome all of you. Um, I hope that all of you are staying healthy and safe with your family. I apologize for the way I sound today. Presently under a bout of sinusitis. Delhi air quality is plummeted. We are doing something over 484 for PM 2.5. If you have a sense of what that means. Um, I would take this opportunity to congratulate Professor Mekhala Krishnamurthy, who's also a speaker today, Professor Asmita Kabra, and Dr. Buddha Ditya Das for putting together the masterclass series uh, on critical agrarian studies. We at the School of Human Ecology are deeply interested in questions of land, livelihood, political economy in the global south, and I believe that this particular series will be very useful for our own masters and doctoral students. I thank the five very eminent scholars who have kindly agreed to be teachers for this series. Professor Mekhla, who will be starting with the series today, Professor Meher Shah, Professor Mukulika Banerjee, Professor Kenneth Bo Nelson, Professor Connor Joseph Kavanagh. I believe all of them are with us on Zoom today. Thank you for agreeing. I'm sure some of you would know us, and for those of you meeting us for the first time, I would like to say a few words about the School of Human Ecology at AUD. We are an old department in a very young university. The school has completed 10 years of its existence recently, the university being a year older. SHE is an interdisciplinary school that has faculty drawn from ecology and natural sciences as well as social science disciplines. One of the few truly interdisciplinary academic departments in India. When it comes to researching environment and society, we understand the absolute necessity of building methodological and epistemological bridges across the two cultures, and we take this challenge very seriously. The School of Human Ecology offers a uniquely designed interdisciplinary master's program in environment and development and a doctoral program in human ecology. Within the 2 years master's program, we have three distinct thematic clusters: environmental policy and management, that's one cluster; ecosystems and biodiversity conservation is another cluster; environmental politics and justice being the third cluster. These thematic areas are reflected in the specializations and elective baskets are chosen by students and the research projects they complete as part of their field-based internships and dissertations. By now, we have graduated about 150 students from our master's program, all of whom carry forward our core values of critical thinking and engaged scholarship. The School of Human Ecology is also involved in uh, practice through our two associated units at the university. We have collaborations within schools and centers within AUD as well. One being the Center for Urban Ecology and Sustainability, which is a research center established at the university, specifically looking at issues of urban ecology in Delhi, and the Social Impact Assessment Unit, um, which carries out impact assessment studies for the state government of Delhi for developing projects that involve involuntary land acquisition. In addition, faculty members have a lively engagement with society through their repertoire of research projects and collaborations. Um, in other words, we actively engage with the policy worlds of policy and practice. and the many dilemmas of ethics and politics, even as we remain committed to the values of equity, justice, and environmental sustainability. To conclude, I invite all of you to visit us in Delhi as and when such visits become possible. We would love to collaborate with and learn from the many students and scholars who are participating in this series. I look forward to the session and the discussion today. Warm welcome to all of you once again. I now hand over the stage to my colleague, Professor Asmita Kabra, for introducing the Masterclass series and also to the teaching and research on critical agrarian studies at SHE. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was Dr. Suresh Babu, the Dean of the School of Human Ecology and also the Director of the Center for Urban Ecology and Sustainability at Ambedkar University, Delhi. It's an honor and a privilege to welcome this wonderfully diverse group of people from all over the world to the first masterclass in critical agrarian studies here at Ambedkar University, Delhi School of Human Ecology. This series is one of the really few gifts of the ongoing pandemic. It evolved through conversations between me and my colleague, Dr. Buddhaditya Das, as I was working towards making an effective transition to online teaching of my master's course titled Agrarian Change and Rural Development. And it was while I was discussing our fledgling ideas on this online mode of teaching with Mekhala Krishnamurthy that the three of us realized that we were responding to a really important need. And this fact, I think, is borne out by the wonderful diversity of today's audience, cutting across geographies, time zones, stages of work in academia, and also in the world of practice. So as a part of the series, we have tasked our 5 eminent speakers in the coming month to introduce the students and research scholars to the broad sweep of disciplinary and theoretical perspectives on their particular theme, and also to connect these sort of broad theoretical perspectives with the lived realities of agrarian and rural societies in which these speakers have been engaged for many, many years. Now, the focus of critical agrarian studies at the School of Human Ecology at AUD is on what we have now been increasingly referring to as marginal ecologies. So the grasslands, deserts, drylands, forest frontiers, swidden cultivation areas, and high mountain landscapes, both in India and elsewhere in the world. We believe that these landscapes have remained on the margins of mainstream agrarian studies, which still continues to be driven primarily by narratives that are incubated in the context of the more intensive agrarian areas in lowlands and river valleys. However, in contemporary times, these marginal ecologies are becoming the focus of very intense debates on development and sustainability. The land and the resources of these regions are of great interest to industry because they are potential sites for mining, hydel projects, solar and wind parks, salt panning, cement plants, special economic zones, what have you. At the same time, they are also the focus of massive conservation efforts due to their immense biodiversity values. And caught in the midst of these conflicting pressures are the economically poor, marginalized, predominantly rural, and increasingly mobile wage workers, pastoralists, and other peoples who inhabit and have inhabited these ecologies, these marginal ecologies. So it's the everyday lives and livelihoods and the situated histories and the political struggles and the changing socio-cultural realities of such communities that are the focus of agrarian studies at the School of Human Ecology. And it's exactly with this in mind that we chose the 5 themes for this first iteration. Hopefully there will be more later of the Masterclass series. We believe that understanding the complex nature of land, water, markets, democracy, and collective action is crucial for scholars working in rural regions of the global south. So without further ado, I now hand you over to my co-curator, Dr. Buddhaditya Das, who's assistant professor at the School of Human Ecology, to introduce our first speaker of the series, who's also a co-curator of the Masterclass series. So over to you, Buddhaditya.
Thank you. Thank you, Asmita. Good afternoon, everyone. Before I introduce today's speaker, I'd like to go over some housekeeping rules very briefly. So we've had an overwhelming response to the Masterclass series. Over 500 people across many countries and from India especially also registered. We have not been able to accommodate everyone on Zoom. As a result, many people are watching this live on YouTube on the official School of Human Ecology YouTube channel. I would also like to inform everyone participating that this lecture is being recorded, and we intend to edit it later and use it for instructional purposes and put it up in the public domain. I request everyone to switch off their videos and their mics are already off. The talk, the speaker will speak for 45 to 50 minutes and followed by the question answer session. The question answer session will be moderated by Professor Asmita Kabra. Because of the technical issues associated with this kind of an online lecture, we ask everyone to post their questions on the chat box, and they will Professor Kabra will collate and ask them and put them to the speaker. For those who are watching this on YouTube, we have disabled comments on YouTube, but if you have a question, we encourage you to write to our email, which is sheconference@aud.ac.in, and someone will actually take your question from there and share it with the moderator. So with that, I'll now introduce our speaker for today. It is my pleasure and privilege to introduce the speaker for the first lecture in the Masterclass series, Professor Mekhala Krishnamurthy. For students and scholars working on Indian agriculture, Professor Krishnamurthy needs no introduction. She writes consistently on some of the key challenges facing farmers and farming in India. She is an influential and lucid voice today, intervening in the furious debates around agrarian markets and market-based reforms in the country. I encourage all our participants to read her recent articles on the contentious farm legislations in the Hindustan Times, the Indian Express, and the digital news platform, The Print. Professor Mekhala Krishnamurthy is Associate Professor of Sociology and Social Anthropology at Ashoka University. She is also a Senior Fellow at the Center for Policy Research, New Delhi, where she leads the State Capacity Initiative. She has trained at Harvard University, the University of Cambridge, and at University College London, where she completed her Ph.D. in Anthropology as a UCL Global Excellence Scholar. Mekhala's work engages with classical and contemporary questions animating the anthropology of the state and the market. She has studied the changing social, economic, and political lives and relationships of an agricultural market, or mandi, in the central Indian state of Madhya Pradesh. Mekhala has an abiding interest in grappling with the diversity and complexity of agrarian markets, regional capitalism, and economic life in India. She has recently completed a major interdisciplinary and comparative research project on agricultural markets, agro-commodity networks, and farmers' incomes in Punjab, Bihar, and Odisha. For those interested to read Mekhala's work, I would strongly recommend the lovely ethnography of the wheat grain market in Madhya Pradesh titled Reconceiving the Grain Heap, published in 2018 in the Contributions to Indian Sociology journal. Do also read the concise and yet very comprehensive essay on fields, markets, and agricultural commodities in the edited volume on critical themes in Indian sociology. With this, I hand over the floor to Professor Krishnamurthy for the inaugural talk in the Masterclass series. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much to AUD, to the Dean, to Asmita and Buddhaditya. I can't tell you what a enormous pleasure and privilege it is to be here. Asmita, Buddha, and I share a long-term work and commitment to work in central India and to Madhya Pradesh. Buddha and I share this commitment to a particular place called Harda as well. And it is, really such a pleasure to be able to work with them to put this together. And hopefully it's just the beginning of, a series of such talks and discussions that we will be able to launch today. Also, there is something uniquely, I suppose, inspiring and terrifying about anything titled a masterclass, particularly on something as complex and baffling as agricultural or agrarian markets. Even more so because in this audience, there are those from whom I have actually learned so very much. And so it is much more in way of a studentship than a masterclass that I offer the sort of framing that I will proceed to share with you over the next few, 45 minutes or so. So let me begin with that this is a modest offering, and it is just to help us think through, the complexity that are agrarian markets. Also, when we originally put this series together, land had come first. And I felt actually quite comfortable with starting with agrarian land and then moving to markets. In some ways, markets can come at the beginning or the end, and we'll see that, right? Wherever you begin, you have to interconnect many aspects of the agrarian. And so I also am not sure whether this is as an inaugural talk, I would like to actually sort of present this more in the way of thinking about relational complexity across agrarian and non-agrarian, spheres of life, labor, work, and social change. So let me share my screen and begin. So I hope that's visible. Okay, I'm going to start. So like I said, when you think about agrarian markets, and here it's interesting because the word is agrarian, which to me encompasses agriculture, but by its very definition goes beyond agriculture. And the agrarian always includes a relationship with the non-agrarian, the agricultural and the non-agricultural. And it also does with the rural and the urban. So agrarian exchange or agrarian markets are already more complicated than the way we would usually frame a very specific interest in agricultural markets. This talk has been given at a time when, as Buddha mentioned, over the last several months, there has been an unusual amount of interest on Indian agricultural markets and the ways in which they are regulated. This is a subject which has remained extraordinarily understudied. When I began my work about in 2008, when I went to the field for the first time to study mandi in Madhya Pradesh, I used to joke, even in my discipline, there were more mall ethnographies than mandi ethnographies. And these institutions, as well as the systems that they are part of, remain remarkably understudied. So, this is part of an effort to give you a sense of some of the great literature in history, in sociology, in anthropology, in political economy, in economics, in political science, but it remains, marginal, and we all need to do much, much more work in this area. Let me begin with the idea of the difference between agrarian exchange and agrarian markets. Because of course, agrarian exchange involves a large number of relationships and transactions that are actually non-market. It involves exchange within the household, within families, within communities. It would, absolutely signal and remind us of the literature on gift. And commodity exchange is only one part of that, from which we start thinking as soon as we think about markets. So, when I began this work, and particularly as an anthropologist, when you think about the post-harvest market, and this is Van Gogh and one of his images of harvests, but when you think about the post-harvest market, particularly in Indian sociology and Indian anthropology, you actually study it in terms of non-market exchange, right? You think about the literature, and I often say that there was the grain heap has produced at least a small mountain of ethnographies and anthropological literature, because for a very long time, it was one of the most important processes, the division of the grain heap, that was studied on the threshing floor after the harvest in village India. And it was seen as, Professor Vasavi called it the locus classicus of non-market exchange, of traditional exchange of a system which was based on hierarchy and caste and a range of other relationships, which were, seen very distinctly as reproducing a system, an economic system that was defined by its non-market character. And one of the things that, over the years, and particularly in the 1980s, and then since then, there's been an assertive sort of questioning of this, right? Because of course, the market was everywhere. There were subsistence relationships, there was redistribution, there were, relationships of hierarchy and non-market transfers. There was gift, there was tribute, but there was also surplus. And there were these long historical processes of commercialization. So when you read the anthropological literature alongside the literature of economic historians of the same sort of vast territory of agrarian India, you started seeing that the grain heap was part of an unfolding, uneven and evolving relationship between fields and markets. And, again, in the 1980s, a number of people, particularly at the Center for Development Studies and K.N. Raj's book, tried to look at the commercialization and the regional diversity in the commercialization process. In anthropology itself, in a very important paper called Misconceiving the Grain Heap, Chris Fuller actually made this point, right? That the Jajmani system, which was what we popularly called village-based exchange, was, he pushed and said, and actually an anthropological fiction. And that the anthropologists were just, not able to see the market, which was all around the heap, both in terms of revenue, where the state often extracted its share in cash, but where there were transfers, both of cash and credit, which hitched this heap into these vast processes of commercialization. So one of the things that is very interesting, and when you think about this, in terms of a disciplinary tradition, there was a great emphasis on the embeddedness of agrarian exchange and the embeddedness of that exchange in society. And so we have, anthropologists like Denis Vidal and others who have also pointed out that the market was seen as an imposition. The market was seen as an unfamiliar and modern institution that was entering and disrupting, traditional agrarian society. But anthropologists were, far, I think, so engaged that the market was too abstract, right? So the market was the abstraction, and the heap allowed you to focus on embeddedness, right? So this was clearly a problem because we missed out on studying surplus and commercialization and revenue, which existed and coexist still today with subsistence and food security and a whole range of distribution that continues to happen. So this was the first problem. Today, however, we have another problem. Or another way of thinking about the market. This, if you go online to the Ministry of Agriculture today, you will be introduced to the National Agricultural Market, which is popularly known as ENAM. And ENAM is seen as this, vast, seamless, integrated portal for agricultural exchange across India, where you integrate farmers and traders, and you have a entry point to a platform which will then link all of these different institutions. And now, very interestingly, the way the ENAM platform is imagined, it is seen as the mandis, or the networks through which commodities flow and through which heaps get materialized and dematerialized, are actually seen as the back end, right? They're seen as the back end, and this portal is actually seen as the front end of what is an integrated, seamless market. Now, interestingly, although each of these processes talk about specific physical elements, farmer registration, the splitting and merging of produce into lots via an application, sampling, assaying, and approval for trade, all of which are very, as we'll see, very complex processes. It actually, what it does is it puts the heap at the back end, right? So what you actually have when you look at ENAM is a movement from the marketless heap of the anthropologists of village India to the heapless market of a wonderfully integrated and seamless platform, right? And it's really interesting because in this case, where the market was too abstract for the anthropologist to notice it all around, the heap is now too embedded, too material, too vested, and it interferes with our technocratic visions of the market. But materiality and abstraction have always gone together. So the marketless heap and the heapless market, both cashless, because we're supposed to move to this idea of seamless integration or non-market cashless redistribution, seem to miss out the relationship between materiality and abstraction, which define real and actually existing markets. And so I'd like us sort of think about what exists in the middle, and I will just sort of take you through a set of images, right, from harvest. This is the threshing soybean harvest in Madhya Pradesh. And I'll just run you through it for a minute to give you a sense of the kind of materiality and technologies and mediations and people and institutions and sites that we are actually talking about, which both the marketless heap and the heapless market, invisibilize in different ways. Right. So, here is the soybean heap after it has been threshed. These are farmers waiting on an auction platform, waiting for their produce to be auctioned. This is a family of laborers who had spent time beaning or going over a field after the harvest, after the harvester has gone through, collecting the spilt grain, which they will then thresh and sell in the mandi in smaller lots. So the large lots and big size you can see of larger farmers who are bringing their lots. These are, usually laborers, smaller farmers bringing small lots of produce into the market. These are traders' hands as they sample and then auction the produce. Here are farmers waiting as a mandi official of the state sits and cuts a parchi or a slip to tell them where they are to go. And this is the soda, the contract slip. This is the next harvest season, which is actually the wheat harvest in the same mandi. And here you see labor mixing soybean. You see a digital moisture meter, the entry of different kinds of technologies and devices for mediation and for different kinds of processes. So traders do manual sampling, but digital moisture meters make their way into the markets. These are traders just outside the physical market yard who deal in the futures market, and they're sub-brokers for futures, for participation in the futures exchange that's happening right outside of the mandi. Labor with their manual weighing scales and with electronic weighbridges. This is a laborer who actually goes and picks up the spilt grain on the auction platform at the end of the auction, when the auction has concluded. And this is chana that was being picked in this particular case. She will then sort through it and clean it, and she and two other of her fellow workers will then sell it. A portion of this will go towards the labor fund, and a portion of it will be given as wages to them when it is sold in the same market from which they have collected it. This is a decade ago, after an extremely pulsating wheat procurement season, where thousands upon thousands of quintals of wheat entered the market yard and have been stored for dispatch. These are laborers, and they're not even laborers, they're just poor residents of the city who come into, and this is actually the scene right next door. This is an empty platform at the end of the day, where they collect the spilt grain with the palms of their hands. I haven't even shown you the mills outside of the mandi complex, or both the soybean plant, or the wheat mill, a flour mill, or the chana mill, or the dal mill. We haven't seen the bazaar, the lines for the fertilizer queue right outside this mandi yard. And we have been, just looking at one aspect of it, and I've left out so much. But it does give you a sense of the kinds of relationships that we have to really grapple with when we are talking about real and existing markets. I put these terms here now because over the last few months, these are the terms that we have discussed when it comes to the new regulatory reforms that have been proposed and now have gone through Parliament. Freedom, competition, choice, access, income, accumulation, exploitation, wealth, welfare, security, and sovereignty. These are the kinds of terms that we understand without engaging with the diversity, complexity, and dynamism of actually existing markets. And I think this is, if this is the only thing we take away, one understands, and I was just showing you one market. This is one market in Madhya Pradesh for 2 commodities. Each commodity will give you a range of different relationships, but as you go from market area, even within the same district, you will see extraordinary complexity and diversity, certainly across states, within states, across agroecological regions. You will see diversity, complexity, and dynamism. And therefore, and this is something I've learned repeatedly from engaging closely with the work of Barbara Harris-White and others who have spent time actually studying real markets, is that specification is a general requirement when we talk about agricultural or agrarian markets, right? And that means, and to specify, it means we have to get into questions of the market system, we have to understand market structure, we have to engage deeply with market organizations and institutions, and then really try and understand these relationships. One of the exciting things about actually going back to an anthropology, and why I always say it's both a departure and a return when you think about the grain heap, is that relational complexity remains a constant in studying the grain heap, whether you study it on the threshing floor or you study it in the market yard. And this relational complexity is at the core of trying to unravel this. But how do we get at this relational complexity? And you might get at it from particular sites. You might study a village, and Ben Crow's work, where he actually looked at village exchange, mud floors, right? You might study processes, you might study practices. And you will begin with all of these, but what you will do is you will come back as you start tracing any of them with any fidelity to market systems and market structures and market organizations and market relations. So you can begin with the site, you can begin with the process, you can begin with the practice, and you will find your way sort of almost irretrievably if you do it with any degree of seriousness in that complexity. And one of the things that you will discover as soon as you pick up a site, a process, or a practice is that these different elements of the system, production, marketing, exchange, processing, distribution, and consumption, which we go to great lengths to conceptually separate, as we must, because we have to make some progress and have some conceptual clarity. We also go to great legislative lengths, as we'll see, to separate, say, marketing and trade, as we have in the recent acts, for example. Whatever you do, as you get on the ground and start tracing markets, production, marketing, exchange, processing, distribution, and consumption will come to be interlinked, will come to be interrelated in different and complex ways. And they, will do so across both time and space. So, you will see this happen both in terms of how quickly something is consumed from the time that it is both harvested and then processed and consumed. You will see this in terms of how long you might take to sell something. You might hold on to a crop, you may store it and sell it at another time. You will find this in contractual forms, when you make an agreement and when it comes to be settled. So these are complex relationships and they spread across vast territories, but they're also intimate, right? So you will see a single entity, a seed, produce great complexity when you start thinking about, is it an input or is it an output? And when is it an input and when is it an output? It's an input at the time of sowing, but very shortly after harvest, farmers will retain a certain portion of their output as seed for the next year's harvest. So you will see, and I remember once standing in the mandi, there was a nice debate that was going on because they had apprehended a trolley load of soybean, and it had come into the mandi yard. And the driver said, this is not soybean, this is seed. This is seed for something else. It is not actually output. It is input for another process and therefore comes under another regulatory system, right? So these are not just at the level of intimate scale, but at the level of regulatory life complexities. But the same commodity will also change and be processed and transformed in the processes and practices of storage and transportation. In the way in which they are aggregated. When small lots become larger lots, something changes in all of it. The lot itself changes. In the processes of grading and standardization. Of course, in processing, when a commodity is turned, a raw material is turned into another commodity, or commodity form changes itself. And therefore, at every stage of this process in agrarian markets, there is an extraction or a transformation and an exchange of value. This is important, and here I mentioned once Bush, who writes about the moral economy of grades and standards, because in agricultural markets, these are not just intimate processes; they are also amongst the most contested processes at the level of capital and at the level of large-scale corporate, agriculture and agricultural marketing systems as well. So the debate about what standard is set for FAQ, fair average quality, is something that will be negotiated at every site. In Odisha, for example, it used to be called in paddy, katni chutney. Right? Katni chutney was when you decided with the procurement agents how much deduction would be acceptable to have a lot be considered fair average quality. But this will also be discussed at the high end of branding, at the other end, where you will have discussions with regulators about who can use the term fresh to label milk or to label certain kinds of products like orange juice, right? And each of these are deeply negotiated because they represent margins and interests They include and they exclude. So this is why moral economy of grades and standards, because these are not simple terms. They are the very sites in which there is a negotiation and a contest, often a conflict of interests. They are exactly the places where both producers and consumers, see and are mystified by the ways in which they are included and excluded, right, from commodity trade. But these same processes, storage, transportation, aggregation, standardization, processing, are both about labor and logistics. And this is incredibly important because, again, we don't know, does transportation belong to marketing? Does it belong to processing? Does it belong to trade? Right? The process of transport itself is complex. Logistics as well. I remember whether it's the gunny bags, which suddenly all of us were very aware of in the midst of COVID, because for the wheat procurement, at the wheat procurement season, Punjab and Haryana asked West Bengal to open its jute factories and resume work, right? So these gunny bags used to lose weight when they were unfurled in the market yard. And so the unfurling and drying of the gunny bags meant weight was lost. And I remember a state warehousing corporation, manager who once said, like Vishwakarma, we had to build new warehouses overnight while the wheat magically loses and gains weight, right? And it's so all of this is happening at the same time. So there's both a division of labor that is at work, and there's also a division of logistics. And just as with the moral economy of grades and standards, there is contestation and margins in each of these handovers. It should be obvious by now that this is all incredibly commodity specific. Barbara Harris-White always uses this word, which I now use all the time as well to talk about it, but it's this wonderful and archaic word, quiddity. I think I heard her once say it's the thingness of things, right? And this is its essence. And quiddity, manifests in so many complex ways in these markets, both physically and socially. And it affects a whole range of relationships, not just both around time and space, because it affects the timing of a whole range of things, but it affects the status of various commodities as well. And so things affect market relations, and market relationships affect the ways in which things move. And of course, commodities themselves move in and out of commodity form. So a crop goes through a whole range of processes to become a commodity, and then it moves in and out of commodity form itself. So here, let me pick up some speed, because I think we still have quite a bit to cover. But we tend to think about markets primarily as the relationships between buyers and sellers. But it is already obvious that all of these relationships and processes that we've already talked about, storage and transportation, aggregation, standardization, processing, distribution and consumption, are also part of market life. And so you cannot think about that as the intermediation of the market. It is the market. It is how the market is structured and organized, and how it actually is dynamized and works. And so this brings us to the problem of intermediaries. And there is a rich literature, and as soon as you actually get into the literature on agricultural markets, you quickly lose this a way of thinking about intermediaries as distortionary figures, middlemen who exploit and have huge margins. Because as you get into the complexity of market relationships, you see that firms and individuals and firms perform a whole range of tasks, right? And these are in no way simply distorting a market. They usually are very well adapted to the conditions of production and the conditions of consumption in any given market. And it is incredibly difficult to simply remove intermediaries or disintermediate these markets. It's often a misguided goal in and of itself, because what one often doesn't realize is the way in which intermediation and these relationships actually distribute risk. And they also, sort of in very complex ways hold together systems of redistribution and reproduction that are very precarious. And so simply removing those actors without actually paying attention to the roles that they play in these markets, that the risk that they actually carry, and the multiplicity of roles that they play, because margins are rarely achieved from a single activity, and seasonally they may change depending on all the activities that you actually perform. And all those activities then happen through a whole range of contractual forms. And there's great contractual diversity and a multiplicity of transactional forms. These are both formal and informal. And again, they're mediated over time. They may be one time, they may be repetitive, they may be done immediately in the spot market, they may be future transactions or advanced, and they may involve invariably different kinds of rotations of credit and capital. They are also both price and non-price, right? So there are different kinds of distribution that sometimes happens here. I'm both in terms of customary form. So sometimes a certain amount of commodity is taken and put, like in the case of the mandi I was showing you, where they pick up the spilt grain and then sold or put in a fund or pay for certain services through commodities themselves. And so this may be done through both in cash and in kind. But also here, it reminds me, just thinking about risk in commodity form, a conversation I once had with a sabzi artya, vegetable artya, who said in a wonderful way, he said, the thing about, and this takes you to quiddity as well, the thing about vegetables is that kachi nahi rukti hai, कच्ची नहीं बिकती है और पक्की नहीं रुकती है, right? It will not sell when it is raw, and it will not wait when it is ripe. And between the ripening and the rotting is where I function. This is where I work, right? And as he said this, he also cut a piece of fruit and gave it to a lady who was, begging in the mandi that day. And he said, all of this is part of the market's life. So there's a whole range of different actors who participate in these kinds of exchanges. But each exchange is also about both price and non-price factors. I've already mentioned credit. It is the one that we understand most deeply, and we spend the most amount of time thinking about, the interlocking of credit and commodity exchange. But this interlocking and interlinkages happen across multiple markets in production and marketing and exchange. So you will see a whole range of markets, land markets and labor markets, and often water and input markets, seed I mentioned as well. So inputs connected along with credit in these relationships. But also they include non-market relationships like weight. And again, here they involve extraordinary kinds of conversions. So one of the things we would often find in our fieldwork, particularly in Odisha and Bihar, is that quality would be adjusted in weight. So a quality deduction would actually be made in the form of weight. So it would be 5 kgs for quality, right? And so these kinds of commensurations, these kinds of conversions are constantly happening between different elements of exchange. That was in actually quality assessment or assaying, but the way you will do the deduction will actually be through weight. And farmers and traders are extremely used to these kinds of movements and conversions. But weight itself is, this tells you quite a lot about the balance of power. This is just an illustration of what happened in Hadda Mandi over a period of 15 years. Big contestation, but up until 2000, weight in Hadda Mandi would be taken in the form presented above, where you had a heap that came before the weight. So you first had the heap, then you took the weight. After an electronic weighbridge, which came after a huge mobilization by farmers, a lot of resistance by both the state and the traders, but then finally pushed through by farmers and brought into place, there was an electronic weighbridge. Now with this electronic weighbridge, you took weight full, then you put a heap, then you went back and did the weight again when it was empty. But you see what happens, the heap has shifted now from before the weight to after the first weight is taken. So now if you actually were to steal grain, if you were a laborer, you would not be stealing from the farmer as you would in the first instance, but in the second instance, you would actually be stealing from the trader. This completely changes the power dynamics of whether grain theft actually happens or not in the mandi, right? And this is why this was such a contested change, because it made the heap less vulnerable to theft, to siphoning. Right, and these are these wonderful descriptions that farmers would often and traders would give you, and they were racked with bitterness and with humor, which is very common in agrarian exchange, that things are often delivered with both bitterness and humor, but they would tell you exactly about how these various forms of manipulation of weights and measures actually happened and what it took to shift them. And each and every time you shifted them, you were reflecting a balance of power shift in the market. You were not only shifting the balance of power, it was not a technocratic change. It reflected the ability of farmers to actually extract or mobilize this kind of change, right? And so it was a very sensitive index. But in the end, these processes, both price discovery processes, the way in which auctions are conducted, the ways in which information circulates or doesn't circulate in these markets, affects how you actually think about price responsiveness, how various actors respond to prices, and price realization. But there's they say a big slip between price discovery and price realization. The price in an auction and the price that you actually take away when you finally calculate the amount after you've made all your deductions, after you've cleared all your debts, after you've looked at all the various kinds of adjustments, after you've looked at the interest that will be paid depending on whether the payment will be made immediately or not. And so between price discovery and price realization, there is all of this field of power that we need to sort of understand in very particular ways for particular times and places, which also tells you that there is a big movement. If from price discovery to price realization, there is all of this market power that manifests itself when you go from income to accumulation, or what you take home, price realization to accumulation, an even more complex process. Again, where people have written, and Barbara Harris White and others, about the social structures of accumulation, the complexity of these processes of accumulation, and the families, the firms, and the networks through which accumulation happens, the institutions, gender and caste, and of course, we'll come more specifically to the state, but a whole range of very complex and very differentiated relationships that exist here. And as I move towards bringing this together, as soon as you move to this question of accumulation, you are already firmly, particularly when you're talking about small farmers and small producers and small traders, which is what characterizes Indian agricultural systems, you are already looking at the agrarian and non-agrarian. You are already looking at diversified livelihoods. You are looking at a range of different kinds of mobilities and immobilities. And you're looking at a whole range of different kinds of farm and non-farm activities that are tied together. And this immediately takes you past the distinctions also between the rural and the urban. And here again, this is something I've now sort of said often, because when we think about agriculture and agrarian change, we typically think about farmers reproducing themselves and their prosperity as farmers. And we talk about this as a condition of reproduction, which it is. And agricultural commodity markets precisely produce and reproduce in very precarious ways these relationships. And often wealth and poverty accumulation and exploitation are happening in the same places in ways in which people are interlinked. So we cannot really understand why there is no easy celebration of the idea of freedom without understanding these relationships and constraint. But one of the key things about agriculture is that people always move in and out of it. And you move in and out of agriculture both under conditions of distress and when you are actually able to accumulate a good proportion of the surplus. And that may then be reinvested and invested outside of the agrarian in a similar way that remittances may come in from non-agrarian places, from the cities, and go straight into being able to buy your fertilizer for this season. Right? Or maybe used to pay for a harvest or take a loan or actually increase the amount of land that you lease or rent. So these relationships are very complex. And the critical thing is about thinking about the terms of engagement. And I think this is as true when we think about the terms of engagement in markets, which is why when we talk about agrarian markets, and to go back to the heapless market or the marketless heap, we often think about access to markets. But the truth is, for the vast majority of farmers, markets have accessed them at different times in different places. And so farmers, markets through these processes of commercialization of access farmers, it's about the terms of their engagement in markets. But it's also the terms of your engagement as you move between the agrarian and non-agrarian and the rural and urban. So it's, it's about strengthening this. So I will end where many might have begun, and certainly where all the debates about agricultural reform have been mired over the last few months, but with the multiple and contradictory roles of the state. And it is this complexity that the actually existing state, just like the actually existing market, really engages with. And it has done so through a wide variety of forms. And at different times in those processes of production, exchange, marketing, processing, distribution, and consumption. So you have the land revenue state, which has always and assertively been part of these systems. And we have spent so much time talking about taxation over the last few months that it is worth remembering that revenue has always played a very vital role in the way in which the state has seen the agrarian market. The irrigation state, the forest and forestry state, the famine, relief, and food security state, the scientific state, the extension state, the creditor state, the cooperative state, the state as a producer, and not only in plantations, but in many other kinds of systems where it actually is part of production. The state is, of course, a procurer, a trader, and distributor, particularly when it comes to the public distribution system in India. We have the regulatory state, which is often mixed up with all of these kinds of states, and we don't actually separate it out. The infrastructural state and the welfare state. So over long periods of time, the state has actually reprised all of these roles and affected agricultural markets in very complex ways. So we assume it is one or the other. That, in recent times, this idea that regulation or deregulation, which is really often re-regulation in another form, is the way that we actually operate. The state operates in agricultural markets. But it is through these multiple, often contradictory roles, conflicting roles that the state moves in and out in different parts, often in the same state, same administrative region or agroecological region. It operates very differently across these different particular regions and sites, but then also within a single department. And so here you see contradiction, you see fragmentation, you see siloization, you see dominance at a certain point. And this is actually the ways in which the state functions and operates in these markets. So, we can talk further about the specific ways in which this happens. But I think when you take this overwhelming simplicity with which we think about how the state operates, we forget that often when it comes to a market, it might actually be the state as a cooperative supporter of cooperatives that is more powerful in empowering farmers, or the state in its role as a buyer or procurer that has a greater role on price, and in fact rubs against the regulatory state in a different way, right? The infrastructural state may in fact enable greater public infrastructure and a diversity of ownerships so that different actors might actually access resources, or it may lead to forms of monopolies where that infrastructure is only accessed by a few and a few powerful entities. So, again, credit may be used to strengthen processors, and or it may actually be used to strengthen farmers and give them a choice in the production and marketing process. So in each of these, there are, again, multiple different ways and interests that bear upon how the state actually acts. And often its role is as powerful in its absence as it is in its presence. So I will actually stop here and conclude by saying that hopefully this takes us through a way of thinking about markets and like I said, maybe opens more questions than answers, but provides a framework for really engaging with actually existing markets, agrarian markets in India and elsewhere in the world. Thank you so much.
Wow. Mekhala, if this was a talk in a real live room, I think I would have asked the audience to just put their hands together for a big, big round of applause. Such a wonderful, riveting talk. There are a couple of questions in already. So let me just begin with, and I think it's your last slide, which has animated, the first set of questions. So here's a question from Sheetal Patil, who's asking, with new entrants of farm producer organization FPC, will that bring another set of processes in the marketing of agricultural products? And with this, do we see heaps with markets now? Heaps with markets.
Great. Shall I take a few questions, or shall I answer?
A connected question then from Professor Barbara Harris-White, who's asking that the regulatory state has an intent or interest in not regulating labor. Do you think it's important to add the labor neglecting state to your list? So maybe these two, and then there's a qualitatively different question coming up later. So that we'll pick up after you're done with this.
Yeah, great. Yes, no, I mean, when I saw Barbara, I was here, I was like, she will definitely add to that list of the things that I have left out. As a general principle, I mean, Buddha very kindly mentioned a couple of papers, but generally before I give any talk, including this one, I will go back and read her various pieces of her writing on how to analyze markets and this complexity. So I'll come back to the question of labor and regulation and what it does and doesn't do. But to the FPOs, so I think it's again very useful, and thank you very much for that question, because it's very useful to think about the older forms, right? And I mentioned the cooperative state, in which I would actually include something like, farmer producer organizations as well, in the state's role in promotion, right? And interestingly, in Indian agricultural markets in particular, when you think about the role of the state does two things. We often, even in the articulation of our acts, we talk about it as promotion and regulation. Right? And the promotion elements are often exactly this. I mean, even the establishment of mandis was not purely regulatory role of the state. It was actually the establishment of certain kinds of market sites, right? And this element of promoting farmer producer organizations, and they are actually called, you talk about promoting them, is one of those roles where the state plays both this promotion and regulation role. And in recent times, the word facilitation has started coming in a lot more, and people, these come into the acts themselves. So the question often comes, are you more interested in promoting or regulating? And if you're interested in promoting, who are you interested in promoting? If you're interested in facilitating, what are you interested in facilitating? Is it regulation? Then you're actually regulating an already existing market, right? But you're always doing both. And in some ways, this also links to the question of an interest in not regulating, right? Because when you say promotion and facilitation, it is often assumed that one way in which you promote and facilitate the market is by withdrawing regulation, right? And the way in which regulation originally came about was to actually think about protecting the interests of those who are structurally disempowered in these markets. And so you actually looked at market failure and you looked at asymmetry. And then you came in and said that you are actually both promoting, and that's one of the core reasons why you need regulation, right? But now the language is that in order to regulate, in order to promote, you need to not regulate or deregulate or get out of regulation without actually solving the problems of structural asymmetries in these markets, right? Or the structural constraints that farmers have. And one of those structural constraints when it comes to farmer producer organizations has been the power to aggregate or to collectivize. So I would just say two things. One is that I think it's really important when you look at FPOs to go back to the history of cooperation and cooperatives, and to also understand the very commodity specific nature of our success in cooperatives. And of course, there's been, again, a rich literature in sociology and in other disciplines have also, but, B.S. Baviskar, Atwood, who studied the cooperative movements and looked at what was distinctive about the ways in which the relationships between large and small farmers, between producers and processors was organized in the case of perishables like both sugar and dairy and milk. So one thing is that we must go back to that. One of those things that those relationships teach you is a very profound relationship between the social and the technical. One of the problems, I think, and this has been pointed out by a number of people who have been part of the cooperative movement and who have studied FPOs across India, is that there is very little attention to institutional investment, to how difficult it is to actually, sustain these interests and to actually sustain this kind of institutional participation. And that's part of the problem, that, in not every case, not every commodity, not every context, would you want to have a farmer producer organization. And what we've done is actually produced rules and guidelines and institutions which are to now create 10,000 of them without enough clarity about whether you need them, where you need them, what their role will be, what are the particular markets in which they're going to engage with, what is the relationship between the social and the technical in those markets, how do you actually deepen participation. So that's one big challenge that is actually happening when you think about that particular element of the state. I think I sort of tried to answer the question about regulation, but yes, I absolutely agree that the interest in not regulating is critical here. Certain people, and this was actually very interesting in our research in Bihar, for example, right? Which was upheld and has been much in the news because 14 years before they actually deregulated and repealed their APMC Act. But what was interesting there was the removal of APMC regulations. It seems from all the research was clearly a political move. And it was about the interests that controlled the regulatory marketing system, right? So there may be many reasons that you actually want to release. And so in the sites that we saw, this was actually really good for large traders. It got rid of small traders. It saw a certain degree of consolidation. So, I think it's a very important question that we have to ask. When you think about deregulation, or when you think about particular kinds of regulation, whose interests are you serving? And here it's about allowing for certain kinds of exploitation. So labor would be one, small farmers are another, who are left, unprotected in these markets now as you move. And so they don't have the ability to even ask or claim make for a mandi or a regulated market. And I think it's the withdrawal of a promise that a lot of people have picked up on in the current movement towards deregulation. But I also think there's another parallel and very interesting thing that is happening here, which is that in many other parts, consolidation has actually been achieved through other kinds of regulatory acts. So for example, how much do you put up as paid up capital for a license? Who is allowed to actually take a license? In the case of agricultural markets, certainly we see it on the consumption end, phytosanitary regulations, and a whole range of other kinds of regulations are put in place so that certain small actors are unable to actually participate in the system. So I think there's both a deregulation or a disinterest in regulating, a labor neglecting, a small farmer neglecting, a petty trader neglecting, keeping out and not actually strengthen the terms of their engagement. But there's at the same time this way in which the state actually helps facilitate channel control and channel command. And that has been one of the big complaints of corporations who have participated in Indian markets for centuries, right? Saying that actually we have not been able to get sufficient channel control or channel command. And that is something that I've had very interesting conversations where, large scale trading capital, global agro capital has said the problem with India is that you don't have enough barriers to entry. And therefore, corporate capital, which thrives on actually controlling the channel, prefers to stay asset light. And it allows actually much greater kinds of diversity in institutional life in our markets, which, also I think brings about a certain kind of absorption of both labor and livelihood and inclusion, but also then unless you invest in it systematically, leads to, incredible amounts of vulnerability as well. So, I mean, it's all, I think, interlinked here. And actually being able to ask the political economy question of specific states and in particular commodity markets, what is the interest at work when, regulation happens, I think is extremely important. Okay.
Thank you. Fascinating. So here's a question from Buddhaditya, and I'll probably add to that. He's saying the study of markets through costs of cultivation, farm gate prices. I think the pointer is towards my tribe economists. Seems to miss out on so much of the informality, diversity, and complexity that you speak of. So what kind of methodological methodologies and what kinds of framings actually help, and basically because, as a masterclass, if you're looking at our target audience mainly being researchers and at the master's and PhD level, can we think of sort of toolkits, sets of questions, and I think you hinted at that when you said sites, processes, etc. But what kind of methodological advice would you have for students where you sort of stay away from the flattening of the narrative that seems to be happening in not just policy discourse, but also in theory, but at the same time are able to actually grapple with and come out with something that talks across commodities, across scales, across regions, etc. So we actually nudge you towards blueprints?
Yes, so I'm actually
Masterclass.
I'm actually going to recommend, Professor Barbara Harris-White is here, and she has a wonderful book on methods of studying studying agricultural markets. It's a method, it's really a book, and it can be updated and we can look at it again, and hopefully there will be a new generation of us who will go back to some of those methods and update and think about how we might do that. But I think there's a lot in her field, economics, for both economists. There's in David Ludden's work, for historians, and there's this rich work. I mean, Niladri Bhattacharya has studied, agricultural markets, and so the historians, Shahid Amin. So we have a literature in history, in anthropology, and in economics, and in political science and political economy, right, which has pioneered a set of methods. I think what we cannot do away with is engagement with field sites and field work. I think a persistence, right, with actually going to the field and specifying. Traders always say that in order to trade, you have to take a position. But they say no good trader sticks to their position when the market changes, right? So it's always about commitment and correction. And I think that's very true with how we study markets as well, right? That you have to commit to it, and then you will correct your methods continuously. But there has to be that process of both commitment and correction. I think we have some very good methods in terms of how we get on the ground and start specifying. I think you can study, firms and their complexity. You can do surveys, but it's very tough. Price information, actually getting commodity and price specific information. So, variety and quality specific price information, incredibly tough to do, but can be done if you're aware that that matters, right? So I would say, like, over the last, year and a half of trying to innovate, working with economists and political scientists, surveys can be adapted and worked through. I find there's no substitute for long-term ethnographic work where you stay over seasons. And you watch and you repeat and you see the relationships work again and again, because that's how you then pick up disruption. It's very important to go across seasons, so multi-season, and then also to go back to the same site over years to pick up this kind of complexity. The toughest ones are to get inside markets and firms, right? And that is where you have to actually adopt a whole range of different strategies. But I have found, for example, long life interviews, life histories with millers, with traders, incredibly helpful. Sometimes you also then end up doing composite profiles of different kinds of actors, being able to think about differentiation and all the different things that might help us differentiate. So, your ability to access credit, the kinds of expertise you have, caste networks, etc. So, just being able to constantly move between analytical and methodological, I think helps a great deal as you start work out method. So there are those who follow the commodity. So we actually have a remarkably poor, the US is full of commodity studies. Everybody has got this, the life of orange juice, or the traveling t-shirt, or, the story of cotton and all this. We have done very little of this. So even just following a commodity, like, as long as you know what you're missing, like when I studied a mandi, I knew I was studying the mandi. And so other things were less visible, but I was able to sense their presence and not over-determine what I was picking up here. When we decided to study the whole commodity system or the market, we got relatively less depth into particular market sites or profiles of individuals. When you study it from a farmer's perspective and that relationship, you illuminate the complexity there. So I think as long as you understand that all of this is lit in your mind and you see these connections, you don't over-determine what you have illuminated. And yet all of us need to keep illuminating. And I think the labor of illuminating a single state, a single market, a single commodity, a single set of relations, certain kinds of actors is all very complex. And so I would say all of that labor is worth doing, but with the awareness of all these interconnections that are happening around you. And hopefully we can, write the next version of Barbara's toolkit. But I would very much recommend people read that.
Wonderful. So a couple of more questions.
I just want to make one other very quick point,
sure.
which is about abstraction, right? Like, I mean, this talk has helped I think has sort of made clear that markets are very material and materially dense, and things are all over the place, and there are flows, whether that's money or produce, right, that are moving in different ways. And there are byproducts and all of this complexity. But I would say that it is also important to think about how people think about trade, how they speculate, how they think about risk and then act on it, right? Not to say that what you say and what you do is always very neatly linked at all. And that's why we do ethnographic work and we focus on the non-discursive. But, to point out that actually it's not only about how material conditions, lead to the way in which markets actually work, but it's also the different ways in which people think. Farmers and traders, like they speculate, the state, right? There's a certain kind of relationship between logics and logistics that happen in these markets. And so it's equally important to understand the ways in which people abstract. And certain kinds of abstraction are vital for markets to actually function, right? Forms of commensuration, calculation, and they depend on material devices. And the margins are certainly material, and the outcomes are too. But I think understanding these logics is also very important, right? And they are there in interests, but also they're there as certain ways of approaching a subject. And there's value, how you actually estimate or think of value, how you speculate, right? The ways in which you marshal different kinds of information in a narrative. You have to narrativize in order to act. So these are things that are not that easy to study. But again, these are things that we have become, if you do fieldwork for long enough, you start picking up the ways in which you need to tell a story in order to speculate, right? And the relationships between these and the kinds of scale-making projects that are involved here. Yeah, let's talk.
Yeah, I think we have a question from Amit here, and I think he's picking up on the idea that you spoke about the different kinds of state in terms of the functions or the motivations of the state. And I think that this question is more about the sort of different levels of the state, and you did hint at that. So Amit is asking that the state at the central level tries to regulate the market, but at the local level, local state actors, on the basis of caste, class, corruption, etc., might be disrupting the regulation of markets or restricting access to some people. So he's curious to know how dominance, power, etc., influence the market. So I think this is a plea for sort of reading power and unpacking the local state and bringing this in. And I would probably add to that mix and then say that, when you sort of take the state like this across scales and across departments, but then it's not just those two, right? It's also the matrix between these. So can you think of ways of theorizing this or studies that have done so, which would be interesting? I think what's also coming out is the need to, as we have thought in the masterclass, put together a select reading list that is going to help students towards the methodology questions.
Yes. So I think it's really important here to think about regulation as well as formal and informal, right? So, and state and non-state. So markets are regulated in many, many different ways, but they're also very much regulated by market actors. So, a mandi committee may be a formally regulated market, and then you might have an APMC with mandi inspectors who are actually empowered by the state to perform certain tasks. But you also have traders associations and different groups, both formally registered and those who actually are not formally registered, who influence. So, for example, recently in Bihar, we visited a market where it was a completely informally run market, unregulated, because Bihar doesn't have a regulatory act, but they had split the market. They had decided that the physical space had become too big, and that act had occurred, or that action, through a range of different kinds of people with legitimate authority to do that kind of activity of, splitting a market into two different market yards and then organizing them and reorganizing them. So one is to say that, there's both formal and informal regulation. Secondly, even state actors often do things formally, and often it's informal action that allows them to let the formal system run. So this again gets very complicated. So for example, mandis formally by the act, you cannot you cannot be licensed if you don't have a premise under some mandi acts. And so in Harda, there was this problem that if you wanted to buy the produce in the auction, but then have it delivered to your mill, officially it had to go through your mandi go down. Right? But the traders and the mandi officials actually allowed this kind of, what they called a certain compromise to occur in how they ran the market, because they said this will actually allow trade to occur. Right? And so often to allow mobility or things to move and things not to get stuck, you do a whole range of actions which are not strictly formal. Right? And this is the role that local actors play. And the other thing I found very clearly in the local mandi summits by the local state is that the same actors who in the 1980s were appointed by the most powerful traders, and they would reflect on this also, they basically worked for the trader. They did what he particularly wanted. They cut parchees accordingly. They would disqualify people from mandi elections accordingly. Those same functionaries, 20 years later, when I was, doing field work, would reflect on how much it has changed, right? And how much market power has also changed in these mandis. And I see this question from Vinay about collectivization and farmers' power. And I remember a mandi functionary, a superintendent once telling me that if you want to see how strong farmers are in a market, you should look at the auction floor. If grain is spread all over the place, it means farmers are not able to keep the grain in their trolley, and traders are strong. When you see a greater rise in disputes in the market, right, that means that farmers are beginning to exercise a certain kind of strength in this market. In Harda in the 1980s, farmers used to actually say that labor used to sometimes beat them out of line, move them into a certain line, etc. Today, that would absolutely lead to a riot in this market yard if it was even attempted, right? So the way in which you deal with farmers, the way in which you engage with them has all changed over time. This did not change because the market got regulated. It changed because the farmers in this area got irrigation, started having 2 crops, had a new member of the Legislative Assembly from the local area who used the mandi as a site of mobilization. They had 2 or 3 different farmers organizations actually come into the mandi and insist, and that's how the electronic weighbridge got installed in this mandi. So this would not have happened without changes in production and changes in the status of farmers, economics and social and political in this particular area. So I mean, markets are about vigilance, right? They are about this kind, and it's a constant action of maintenance. And interestingly, I used to often hear, farmers who were smaller farmers and lower caste farmers, so Dalit and Adivasi farmers, tell me that, the Jats and Bishnois, they get in our way. They're terrifying. We stay out of their hair completely. But if they had not fought for the mandi, Harda mandi would not have, mandi nahi sudharti, right? It would not have got reformed. So, here there is a reflection on the fact that actually vis-a-vis large farmers, they lose out in a range of ways. But in terms of having a better publicly regulated market, they can see the contribution, right? And so there's constant inclusion and exclusion. This is not by any means a settled story, but it does indicate the kinds of ways in which these actors can play roles, which actually then tells you why there's such an important need for public accountability and other questions. And in fact, agricultural markets remain very poor, do very poorly in terms of public accountability, whether it's, audits or other things. These are not, they really need a lot of mobilization to hold, these markets to account. So, yeah.
So I think this is very interesting also, Vinay's question, because it's something that is linking us to another masterclass, which is on conflict and collective action, and which I think is also linked to the talk on land. So, so this is very nice, and I would actually encourage, all the people here to sort of be with us through the series. I have two questions, and I don't think we probably have time for more. One is from Shaina, who's just submitted her PhD at the School of Human Ecology. She's saying it's particularly exciting for me as a student of the coconut trade network in the Nicobar Islands. And she's asking about, as you identified the materiality of the crop, for example, the seed as an input and output, how might we extend this to entanglements of perennial crops with their environment and the cultures associated with cultivation?
Yeah. I'm really hoping your research helps us answer this. All I can say is I can imagine that there's a really interesting relationship there, right? And I think seasonality and time is so important here, right? So perishability is obviously one factor that leads to it. Seasonal crops have a different relationship. Long-term crops have yet another relationship. And I will give you a, totally unsatisfactory answer because I haven't studied enough perennial crops to answer this. But this is exactly the kind of specificity that we need, right? So what does it do? And so plantation crops, again, have a very different story here in terms of how we need to understand and unpack these relationships. But when I was about, I think, over a year into work in Harda, there was an old farmer. I was in a village, and a farmer came and said, "Acha, she's still here. Yeah, abhi tak yahan hai. She's still here." So a farmer who I visited quite often said, "No, don't worry, chori lambi fasal le rahi hai. No, Mekhala is taking a long crop." And these are interesting for them, for these farmers. It was particularly important because they used to be cotton farmers, right? So the old farmers used to take cotton in dry, unirrigated times and intercrop with long duration kharif. So soybean is seen as a short duration crop. And so they said, ye sahi hai, lambi fasal mein, in a long crop, the profit is greater, right? The profit is definitely greater. And then they quickly did a calculation to show me how the profits for, say, soybean, the profits for sugarcane would be different versus the profits for teak trees, right? They said, if you took teak, it would take you years, but then you would be trading in lakhs, right? Versus what we do when we take these short duration crops. But immediately the next line came, which said that then debt is also greater, right? So profit is more in the long term, but debt is also much greater, right? Qarz bhi zyada rehta hai. So this was, so they moved from being long duration farmers to short duration crop farmers. They would often talk about the relationship between patience and the ways in which you cultivate it. So the relationships between traders and farmers changed over time, because when you took long duration crops, you used to need much more credit. And that you lifted from mandi traders who were then commission agents, and you cultivated long-term relationships with them because the crop was both, and in this case, it will both be high value in the case of potentially some perennials and, certainly if you traded in teak. And so there was a very interesting relationship between intermediation, credit, debt relations, and the duration of cropping. Right? And it led to a completely different relationship of intermediaries in the mandi when you had cotton and when you moved to short duration irrigated crops. And then it changed further when you had the state become the major buyer, which was very different before wheat procurement came to Madhya Pradesh. So in each of these, you'll see that the type of crop, the nature of exchange, the duration of exchange, the kind of intermediation, the relationship with land, the relationship with industry will get mediated very differently. And I would think that it would have quite a lot to do with how you manage cultivation over a long time period.
Nice. So the lambi fasal, the long crop, I would read as a parable for ethnography and being embedded in a site, and the risks and the payoffs of that too. So
and
probably,
deferral. One of the things about long crops, you have to get very comfortable with deferral. The deferral of your actual income, and that mediation and how it happens. So also true for ethnography.
Yes, I see you taking the parable forward. So probably a last question, or maybe a penultimate one. This is from the live stream on YouTube. So Adrija Chaudhary has sent in a question. She's asking, do the constant negotiations around commensuration or equivalence of different commodity values, such as quality, weight, etc., also extend to the valuation of agricultural labor? Especially in the context of gender-specific tasks and wages in agriculture? And does this complicate our understanding of abstract labor? Wow.
Yeah, another thing that needs to be studied a lot more, or where I think people who work much more closely and think about the nature of work, labor, and industry will be able to reflect on. I mean, just to give a very so yes, would be my immediate sense that the valuing of labor, but also the way in which labor is paid, has a great deal to do with what is happening here. So I'm just thinking about, at a certain point when the mandi was actually a kacha yard, where it was a mud yard, there were sweepers who used to maintain the yard. They used to do lipa poti. And they were also the sweepers who used to be involved. And it's linked to the way in which various processes happens, like weight, as I was telling you, because there was a lot more grain theft. Sweepers used to operate, and they used to have these wonderful descriptions and vivid descriptions of how मोर की पंख की तरह हम फैलाते थे, right? Like we used to spread the grain across the floor like the feathers and wings of a peacock, so that you could actually then collect it and accumulate it or sell it. But also to give you an example why this mattered so much at a particular time when there was actually the commodity value hadn't risen so much, was that a lot of exchange used to be non-monetary. So the water carriers, for example, used to be paid in grain rather than paid in cash. These small amounts would be taken from each lot and by the traders and would be sold. Farmers could not resist. Today, actually, that whole function has been taken over by the mandi itself, and it is paid for in cash. There's water coolers and all that. The water carriers only give the traders water and they are paid in cash. Now, the story of the mandi kachoriwala, who has sold mandis in this kachori since 1970s and has always traded in cash. So he says, as a vendor, I always traded in cash. And there was a Brahmin family of water carriers, which used to be attached to the largest trading firm in Hatta. They used to be paid in grain. And they were paid repeatedly in grain. And as the grain value started rising, so at the end of this period of 25, 30 years, these two are old friends, but the kachoriwala used to come to the hotel of the water carrier, who also bought agricultural land, who also did dealerships and got a hotel, versus the kachoriwala, who actually was just a vendor. He also traded in astrological services in the mandi. But the point is that he never accumulated the same way. And both were Brahmin families. One was a Gujarati Brahmin, one was a Rajasthani Brahmin. But one accumulated in grain and then cash. The other accumulated in cash and remained accumulating in cash and was not able to grow his business because he was not actually able to then access land and a whole range of other relations which were tied up to being a close person in the trader's family and contributing in a range of ways to their accumulation as well. So, here are very complex stories. I would hear similar stories about women's labor, the pala wise, the women who do mixing versus the sweepers who accumulated a lot of grain. And we'll see this in actually some, really interesting nonfiction work about sweepers and how much you accumulate when you buy in grain. And Aman Sethi's book, The Free Man, has this very small example of a woman who, became the bar owner, and she was known as the Chidia because she accumulated grain. So I think it's also access to what is valuable, right? That is very important. And you see a very different story with vending and the abilities to accumulation. So, yeah. I don't know
Wonderful.
if Adrija can do more research on this as well, but yeah.
I do have another couple of questions that we would have loved to elaborate, but I think we'll have to respect the time limits set on us in this Zoom talk. Thank you very much, Mekhala. I'm just going to hand over to Anirudh for the formal vote of thanks, and I'm going to encourage people to attend the next set of masterclasses to also pick up the links between these. So over to Anirudh.
Right. Thank you, Professor Kabra. I would like to formally thank Dr. Mekhala Krishnamurthy for such a fascinating lecture. Your lecture leaves us with a lot to think about, and I hope a lot of us will get in touch with you in the future, and I hope you can answer their questions. I would like to thank the Dean at SHE, Dr. Suresh Babu, for facilitating the seminar series, Dr. Asmita Kabra for moderating the discussion. I would also like to thank our audience today for their questions and their participation, the MA and PhD volunteers of the school who help out with the seminar series, the IT services division at AUD for the technical logistics and to make sure that we have this live streaming on YouTube as well. Fizala Taibullah from the Center for Urban Ecology and Sustainability for designing the wonderful posters for this series. And of course, Dr. Buddhatya Das for coordinating the seminar series. As Professor Kabra said earlier, the next lecture will be on the 18th of November. Our speaker will be Professor Mihir Shah, and details will be sent out very soon. Thanks all for joining.
Thank you so much. And to all of you who are working on agricultural markets and all these wonderful commodity studies and on labor, please do send me an email. And I would love to this is an area where we need so much more work. That immediately when thinking about coconuts or labor or other things, I want to talk to all of you. So please do get in touch. This is very much, like I said, studentship, much more than masterclass that all of us are in.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you all.
Thanks, Mekhala.
We can stop recording now.
Yes, yes. Anirudh, would you please stop recording? Anirudh?